June 1942, 6 months after Pearl Harbor. While America is reeling from defeat after defeat across the Pacific, something unthinkable happens. Japanese forces invade American soil, not some distant Pacific island, not a remote military outpost. They invade Alaska. They raise a Japanese flag over American territory for the first time since the nation's founding. For the next year, enemy soldiers will occupy 2 American islands. American citizens will be captured and sent to prison camps in Japan. American soldiers will die by the thousands try to take back their own country's land. And almost nobody today remembers it happened. This is the story of the Aleutian Islands Campaign, the forgotten battle, the frozen hell, the only ground invasion of American territory during World War II. This is how America almost lost Alaska to Japan, and why this brutal, bloody chapter was erased from our memory. You've never heard this story. But after today, you'll never forget it. To understand how Japanese soldiers ended up on American soil, we need to go back to the dark days after Pearl Harbor. December 7th, 1941 had been a catastrophe for the United States. The Pacific Fleet lay in ruins. Battleships burned. Over 2,000 Americans were dead. And that was just the beginning. In the weeks and months that followed, Japan seemed unstoppable. They swept through Southeast Asia like a tidal wave. Hong Kong fell on Christmas Day. Manila fell on January 2nd. Singapore, the supposedly impregnable British fortress, surrendered in February. The Dutch East Indies collapsed. Burma fell. The Philippines held out until May. But everyone knew it was only a matter of time. By the spring of 1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Pacific, from the frozen north to the tropical south. The co-prosperity sphere, they called it, the largest and fastest military expansion in modern history. America was on the ropes. The Navy was rebuilding. The Army was mobilizing. But victory seemed very far away. And Japanese military planners were already thinking about their next move. The man behind Japan's naval strategy was Admiral Yamamoto. He was the architect of Pearl Harbor, a brilliant tactician who understood American industrial power better than most of his colleagues. Yamamoto had studied at Harvard. He had served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew that Japan could not win a long war against the United States. Their only hope was to strike fast, strike hard, and force America to negotiate before her factories could overwhelm Japan with ships and planes. Yamamoto's next target was Midway, a tiny atoll in the Central Pacific that would give Japan control of the approaches to Hawaii. If Midway fell, Hawaii might be next. And if Hawaii fell, the American West Coast would be within striking distance. But Midway was not the only target. Yamamoto developed a 2-pronged attack. While the main fleet struck Midway, a secondary force would sail north to the Aleutian Islands, the long chain of volcanic islands stretching from Alaska toward Japan across the North Pacific. The Aleutian operation had multiple objectives. It would create a diversion, drawing American attention and resources away from Midway. It would establish Japanese bases in the North Pacific, threatening the American mainland and blocking any potential American attack route toward Japan to the northern islands. And it would eliminate the possibility of American air raids launched from Alaska. This last concern was not theoretical. Just 2 months earlier, in April 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle had led 16B, 25 bombers on a daring raid against Tokyo itself. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact was enormous. The Japanese military was humiliated. The emperor himself had been endangered. The Sacred Home Islands had been violated. Japan's military leaders became obsessed with preventing another such attack. And Alaska, just a few hundred miles from Japanese territory across the Bering Sea, looked like a potential launching point for future raids. So the orders went out. While the main combined fleet sailed from Midway, a northern force would simultaneously attack the Aleutians. The targets were 2 islands at the western end of the chain, Attu and Kiska. The northern force was substantial. 2 small aircraft carriers, the Ryujo and Junyo, would provide air support. Heavy cruisers, destroyers, and transport ships carried thousands of specially trained soldiers from the Japanese Army's northern district, men who had trained in the cold of Manchuria and were supposedly prepared for Arctic conditions. On June 3, 1942, the operation began with an air raid on the American base at Dutch Harbor, the primary military installation in the Aleutians. Dutch Harbor was not much to look with. A few hangars, some fuel tanks, barracks and warehouses, maybe a few thousand soldiers and sailors. But it was America's first line of defense in the North Pacific, and it was about to come under attack. Japanese planes came screaming out of the fog that perpetually blankets the Aleutians. They bombed and strafed the base, destroying fuel tanks, damaging ships, killing soldiers. The Americans fought back with anti-aircraft fire and scramble fighters, but the damage was done. Dutch Harbor was burning. A second raid came the next day. More bombs, more deaths. The message was clear. Japan could strike Alaska whenever they chose. Then, on June 7th, came the invasion itself. Japanese forces landed on Kiska Island first. There was almost no resistance. The only Americans on Kiska were a small Navy weather station with 10 men. They were quickly captured and would spend the rest of the war in brutal Japanese prison camps. One of them would die in captivity. Attu fell the same day. Again, resistance was minimal. The island's population consisted of 45 Aleut natives and 2 white Americans, a schoolteacher and his wife. The Japanese rounded them up quickly. The Aleuts would be shipped to Japan as prisoners. The schoolteacher, Charles Foster Jones, would die under mysterious circumstances. His wife would survive the war, but carry the trauma forever. Just like that, Japanese soldiers stood on American soil. They raised a rising sun flag over Kiska and Attu. They began building fortifications, airstrips, and defensive positions. They had achieved what no foreign power had accomplished since the British burned Washington in 1814. They had invaded the United States of America, and for the moment, there was nothing America could do about it. Before we continue with the military campaign, you need to understand something crucial about the Aleutian Islands. You need to understand why this campaign was so brutal, so deadly, and so completely different from any other battle of World War II. The Aleutians are a chain of over 300 islands, stretching 1,200 miles from the Alaska Peninsula toward the Russian Kamchatka Peninsula. They are among the most remote and inhospitable places on Earth. And in 1942, they were virtually unknown to the outside world. Imagine volcanic mountains rising straight from the sea, their peaks lost in perpetual clouds. Imagine shorelines of jagged black rock, where the North Pacific crashes with relentless fury. Imagine valleys of tundra and muskeg, a spongy waterlogged ground that can swallow a man to his waist. Imagine wind, constant wind, screaming across treeless landscapes at 100 miles per hour or more. And imagine fog. The Aleutians are among the foggiest places on Earth. Warm currents from the Pacific meet cold air from the Arctic, creating a permanent blanket of mist that can reduce visibility to zero for weeks at a time. Pilots called it the Aleutian Weather Factory. It killed more men than enemy bullets. The climate defies description. It is not truly Arctic, but it is far from temperate. Summer temperatures rarely climb above 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Winter temperatures can plunge below zero. But the real killer is a combination of cold, wet, and wind. A condition called willowaw occurs when cold air rushes down from the mountains in sudden violent gusts, capsizing boats and blowing planes off runways without warning. Rain falls over 200 days per year. Not gentle rain, but driving, horizontal rain that soaks through any clothing, any shelter, any protection. Snow and sleet are constant companions. Men who survived the Aleutians often said they were never truly dry for months at a time. In 1942, the American military knew almost nothing about fighting in such conditions. They had trained for European battlefields and Pacific Islands. They had warm weather gear and tropical experience. They had no understanding of what the Aleutians would demand. The Japanese were slightly better prepared. Their northern district troops had trained in Manchuria, where winters were brutal. But even they were not ready for the Aleutians. Nothing could prepare anyone for the Aleutians. One American soldier later wrote that the Aleutians were the worst place on Earth to fight a war. He was probably right. The terrain was impossible. The weather was lethal. The isolation was absolute. Men would go mad from the fog and the wind and the endless gray emptiness. They would kill themselves in numbers that the military tried to hide. They would suffer from trench foot and frostbite and mysterious illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. And they would die, thousands of them, many killed by the enemy, many more killed by the land itself. This was the battlefield where America would try to reclaim its stolen territory. This was the frozen hell of the Aleutian Campaign. The Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska created a crisis in Washington. For the first time since the War of 1812, enemy soldiers occupied American soil. The psychological impact was enormous. The political pressure was intense. Something had to be done. But what? The American military was stretched thin across the globe. The Pacific Fleet was just recovering from Pearl Harbor. The Army was still building its strength. Resources were desperately needed everywhere. North Africa, Europe, the South Pacific, China. Could America really spare forces for two frozen islands at the end of the world? The debate raged through the summer of 1942. Some argued that the Aleutians were strategically unimportant. Let the Japanese have their frozen rocks. They would suffer more than we would try to hold them. Focus on the real battles elsewhere. Others disagreed violently. American territory was American territory. You could not let an enemy occupy your country and do nothing. The morale impact would be devastating. And besides, the Japanese might use the islands as stepping stones for further attacks. Today, Attu and Kiska. Tomorrow, mainland Alaska. Next year, Seattle and San Francisco. The Hawks won the argument. America would fight to reclaim the Aleutians, but it would take time. Nearly a year of preparation, build-up, and preliminary operations before the main offensive could begin. In the meantime, the American military began a campaign of harassment. Bombers flew missions against Japanese positions whenever the weather permitted, which was not often. Submarines patrolled the waters, trying to cut Japanese supply lines. A naval task force engaged Japanese ships in the Battle of the Komandorsky Islands in March 1943, a rare surface engagement that ended in stalemate, but convinced the Japanese that reinforcing the Aleutians would be costly. Meanwhile, the United States built up its forces in Alaska. Thousands of troops arrived. Airfields were constructed on islands closer to the Japanese positions. Ships and supplies accumulated at Dutch Harbor and other bases. The Alaska Highway was pushed through the Canadian wilderness, creating a land route for reinforcements. The commander chosen for ground assault was Major General Albert Brown, and later Major General Eugene Landrum. The Navy component was led by Rear Admiral Thomas Kincaid. They faced an enormous challenge: amphibious assault on fortified islands in some of the worst weather on Earth, against an enemy known for fighting to the death. The target for first assault would not be Kiska, the closer island, but Attu, the more distant one. American planners reasoned that taking Attu first would cut off Kiska from resupply, making it easier to capture later. Attu's garrison was also believed to be smaller, around 2,500 men, compared to over 5,000 on Kiska. The plan called for a two-pronged landing. One force would land at Massacre Bay on the south side of the island. Another would land at Holt's Bay on the north. The two forces would push inland to the mountain passes and link up, trapping the Japanese in a shrinking pocket until they were destroyed. It sounded simple. It would prove to be anything but. On May 11th, 1943, the assault began. The morning of May 11th, 1943, was cold, gray, and foggy. Typical Aleutian weather. The invasion fleet materialized off Attu's coast like ghost ships emerging from the mist. Transports and cargo ships carried 11,000 American soldiers. Battleships and cruisers stood ready to provide fire support. Somewhere above the clouds, Army Air Force bombers waited for breaks in the weather. The landing at Massacre Bay began before dawn. The soldiers clambered down cargo nets into landing craft, a process they had practiced dozens of times. But nothing had prepared them for the cold. The spray froze on their uniforms. Their fingers were numb gripping their weapons. Men who had trained in California and the Pacific Northwest were suddenly thrust into conditions that approximated the Arctic. The beach was not a beach in any tropical sense. It was a narrow strip of black volcanic sand and rock, backed immediately by tundra and mountains that rose steeply into the clouds. The Japanese had positions in those mountains. They were watching. The initial landing met little resistance. Japanese commander Colonel Yamasaki had made a strategic decision. He would not defend the beaches. His forces were too small to hold a perimeter. Instead, he concentrated his men in the high ground of the interior, in fortified positions among the ridges and passes. He would make the Americans come to him, and come they did. The soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division pushed inland, expecting a rapid advance to link up with the northern force. What they found instead was a nightmare. The terrain was impossible. Tundra that looked solid would swallow men to their knees, to their waists, sometimes deeper. Every step was a struggle. Heavy equipment bogged down immediately. Vehicles were useless. Mules brought to carry supplies died of exhaustion. Everything had to be moved by hand, by men who were already freezing and exhausted. The mountains were worse. Volcanic ridges rose sharply, covered in snow and ice even in May. The passes between them became killing grounds, where Japanese machine guns could cover every approach. Artillery had to be manhandled up slopes so steep that ropes were required. And always, the fog limited visibility to yards, sometimes feet. The Japanese were dug in and waiting. They had spent nearly a year fortifying Attu. They knew every rock, every gully, every line of sight, and they were determined to die where they stood. The fighting devolved into a series of brutal small unit actions. Squads of Americans would advance through the fog, only to walk into ambushes. Mortars would rain down from unseen positions. Snipers would pick off officers and NCOs. Men would die without ever seeing their killers. The cold was relentless. Temperatures hovered near freezing during the day and plunged at night. The driving rain soaked everything. Men developed trench foot at alarming rates, their feet swelling and rotting in boots that never dried. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. The Army had not issued proper cold weather gear. Men fought in leather boots meant for temperate climates, in wool uniforms that retained moisture, without the insulation they desperately needed. Medical care was overwhelmed. Evacuation was nearly impossible through the terrain. Wounded men waited hours or days for treatment. Many died of exposure before they could be saved. And still, the battleground on. The northern landing at Holt's Bay faced similar horrors. The plan had called for the two forces to link up within days. Instead, it took nearly 2 weeks of savage fighting through the mountain passes to establish contact. Every ridge was contested. Every advance was measured in yards. Colonel Yamasaki conducted a masterful defense. He knew he could not win. No reinforcements were coming. The Japanese Navy had essentially abandoned the Aleutians after losses elsewhere in the Pacific made resupply too costly. But Yamasaki was determined to make the Americans pay the highest possible price. By late May, the Japanese were being pushed back into an ever-shrinking perimeter around Chichagof Harbor. They were running out of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Hundreds were wounded. The end was approaching. But Yamasaki had one final card to play. It came in the early morning hours of May 29, 1943. The American lines were stretched thin after weeks of combat. Men were exhausted, frozen, many of them walking wounded who refused to leave their positions. They had pushed the Japanese into a pocket barely a mile across. Victory seemed near. Colonel Yamasaki gathered his remaining men. There were perhaps 800 still capable of fighting out of the original 2,500. Many were wounded. All were starving. They had no hope of survival. What they did have was the warrior code of Bushido. They would not surrender. They would not be captured. They would die in a final glorious attack, taking as many Americans with them as possible. Sometime before dawn, the Japanese attacked. They came screaming out of the fog, bayonets fixed, swords drawn, some armed only with knives. This was a Banzai charge, the desperate all-or-nothing attack that would become infamous throughout the Pacific War. But the attack on Attu was one of the first, and one of the largest of the entire conflict. The Japanese swept through the American lines like a wave. They overran forward positions before defenders knew what was happening. They pushed into rear areas, attacking medical stations and command posts. Doctors fought with pistols. Cooks grabbed rifles. Every American became a frontline soldier. The fighting was hand-to-hand in many places. Men grappled in the fog, stabbing and clubbing and strangling. The screaming was audible for miles. Bodies piled on bodies. The Japanese pushed nearly a mile into American lines before they were finally stopped. They reached a medical station and a supply depot, where they caused carnage among the wounded and the support troops. But they could not break through entirely. American reserves, barely organized, threw themselves into the breach. By dawn, it was over. The fog lifted to reveal a scene of horror. Over 500 Japanese bodies lay scattered across the battlefield. Many had killed themselves with grenades rather than face capture. Others had died charging directly into machine gun fire. Colonel Yamasaki himself was dead, killed leading the assault. Barely 29 Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner on Attu, 29 out of 2,500. The rest died fighting or by their own hands. American casualties were staggering. Over 500 killed, over 1,100 wounded, thousands more evacuated with frostbite, trench foot, and other cold injuries. As a percentage of forces engaged, Attu was one of the costliest battles of the Pacific War, second only to Iwo Jima. The battle was over. Attu was American again, but the cost had been far higher than anyone expected. With Attu secured, attention turned to Kiska, the larger Japanese garrison. American planners expected an even bloodier fight. Kiska had more troops, better fortifications, and had been reinforced throughout the occupation. Some estimates put the Japanese strength at 5,000 or more. The invasion force assembled was enormous. 34,000 American and Canadian troops, supported by over 100 ships. It was one of the largest amphibious operations of the Pacific War to that point. Naval bombardment began in early August 1943, pounding the island for weeks. Aircraft dropped tons of bombs whenever weather permitted. On August 15, 1943, the invasion began. American and Canadian soldiers stormed ashore expecting fierce resistance. They found nothing. The beaches were empty. The fortifications were abandoned. The feared Japanese garrison had vanished. For the next several days, the Allied forces swept across the island, certain that the Japanese were hiding somewhere, preparing an ambush. Nervous soldiers fired at shadows. Units accidentally engaged each other in the fog. By some accounts, more than 30 Allied soldiers were killed by friendly fire or booby traps. Over 100 more were wounded. Several men triggered Japanese explosives left behind. A destroyer hit a mine and sank. But not a single Japanese soldier was found. Not one. What had happened? Where had 5,000 enemy troops disappeared to? The answer, it turned out, was a masterpiece of evacuation. On July 28, 1943, under cover of perpetual Aleutian fog, Japanese destroyers had slipped into Kiska Harbor. In less than an hour, they loaded the entire garrison, over 5,000 men, and disappeared back into the mist. American naval patrols, blinded by the fog, never detected them. The Japanese had simply left. They had abandoned the Aleutians without losing a single man in the evacuation. While the Americans were assembling the largest invasion force in the North Pacific, the enemy had quietly gone home. It was a humiliating anticlimax. After months of buildup, after the bloodbath of Attu, the Kiska invasion was essentially a practice exercise against an empty island. The newspapers back home didn't know whether to celebrate the recapture of American territory or mock the military for invading an abandoned rock. But for the soldiers who landed on those black beaches, who spent days patrolling through fog waiting for an attack that never came, who lost friends to friendly fire and booby traps, Kiska was no joke. It was just another chapter in the nightmare of the Aleutians. Why don't you know this story? Why isn't the Aleutian Campaign taught in schools alongside Normandy and Iwo Jima? Why have these battles been forgotten? There are several reasons, and none of them are good. First, the Aleutians were simply not important enough to the overall war effort. The Japanese occupation had been a diversion, and the American recapture was, strategically speaking, a sideshow. While Attu and Kiska were being fought over, the real decisions of the Pacific War were being made at Guadalcanal, at Midway, at Tarawa. The Aleutians never threatened Japan's empire or America's war machine. They were a footnote. Second, the campaign was embarrassing. The military had underestimated the terrain, the weather, and the enemy. They had sent troops without proper equipment. They had suffered casualties far out of proportion to the strategic value of the islands. And then they had invaded Kiska to find nobody home. It was not a story the military wanted to tell. Third, the Aleutians were simply too remote, too isolated, too far from the public eye. War correspondents did not flock to the frozen North Pacific. Film crews did not document the suffering in the fog. The battles happened in a gray void that cameras could not penetrate and words could not capture. Without images, without stories, the public never connected with the campaign. And finally, the veterans themselves often did not talk about it. What happened in the Aleutians was a kind of trauma that did not fit the heroic narrative of World War II. Men suffered from psychiatric breakdowns at alarming rates. Suicide rates were elevated. The combination of combat stress and environmental horror left scars that never healed. Many veterans simply wanted to forget, but forgetting comes at a cost. Over 1,500 Americans died in the Aleutian Campaign. Thousands more were wounded or permanently disabled. They fought and bled and froze for their country, on their country's own soil, and they deserve to be remembered. The Aleut people suffered terribly as well. Japanese occupation had displaced or captured the inhabitants of Attu, but even the Aleuts on other islands, far from the combat, were forcibly evacuated by the American military. They were shipped to camps in southeast Alaska, where conditions were horrible. Hundreds died of disease and neglect. Their villages were looted and destroyed in their absence. When the war ended, they returned to find their homes gone and their way of life shattered. The environmental damage was equally severe. Military installations scarred the pristine landscape. Fuel spills contaminated the tundra. Unexploded ordnance remained dangerous for decades. The Aleutians bear the marks of war to this day. All of this happened. All of this mattered. And all of this has been forgotten. Until now, let's consider a question that historians usually avoid. What if things had gone differently? What if Japan had succeeded in the Aleutians? The Japanese plan had always been limited. They never intended to march on Anchorage or Seattle. The Aleutians were a diversion and a defensive buffer, not a launching point for invasion. But history is full of missions that expanded beyond their original scope. What if the initial success at Attu and Kiska had encouraged bolder thinking? Imagine if the Japanese had established permanent air bases in the Aleutians. From Kiska, bombers could reach Anchorage. From a hypothetical forward base on Adak or Amchitka, they could threaten the entire Alaska coast. The psychological impact would have been devastating. Imagine if the Battle of Midway had gone differently. In our timeline, Midway was a catastrophic defeat for Japan that destroyed 4 aircraft carriers and shifted the balance of the Pacific War. But Midway was a close-run thing. What if the American carriers had been found first? What if the Japanese attack had succeeded? In that scenario, Japan would have controlled the Central Pacific. The Aleutians would have been reinforced rather than abandoned. America would have faced the prospect of sustained enemy presence in its own territory. Or consider the Soviet dimension. In 1942, the Soviet Union and Japan maintained an uneasy neutrality. Stalin was too busy fighting Hitler to open a second front against Japan. But the Aleutians sit just a few hundred miles from Soviet territory. Japanese bases there could threaten the Lend-Lease supply route that carried American supplies to Russia through Pacific ports. If Japan had convinced Stalin that America could not protect its own territory, would Soviet calculations have changed? Would the neutrality have become something more favorable to Japan? These are speculative questions. History did not go this way. America won at Midway. The Aleutians were recaptured. Japan was eventually defeated. But the Aleutian Campaign reminds us that World War II was not inevitable. American victory was not predetermined. There were moments when things could have gone very differently. The soldiers who fought and died on Attu and Kiska were fighting to prevent those alternative histories. They were holding a line that, if broken, might have changed everything. They deserve more than forgetting. The Aleutian Campaign ended in August 1943. For the remaining 2 years of the war, the islands served as bases for American attacks against the Japanese Kurile Islands, the northern territories that had launched the Aleutian invasion. These attacks were not decisive, but they forced Japan to keep significant forces in the north away from the critical battles further south. Every Japanese soldier guarding against an attack from Alaska was one fewer soldier defending the Philippines or Okinawa. After the war, the military importance of Alaska only grew. The Cold War transformed the territory into a frontline position against the Soviet Union. Bases built during the Aleutian Campaign were expanded. New installations were constructed. Alaska became one of the most heavily militarized regions in the country. The lessons of the campaign were studied and applied. The military developed better cold weather equipment, better training for Arctic conditions, better understanding of the unique challenges of northern warfare. When American troops later fought in Korea during brutal winters, they were better prepared than the men who had suffered on Attu. The Aleutian veterans came home to a nation that barely acknowledged their service. There were no parades for the men of Attu. No movies celebrated their sacrifice. They melted back into civilian life, carrying their memories and their trauma in silence. In 1982, the Aleutian World War II National Historic Area was established, finally recognizing the significance of the campaign. Today, you can visit the battlefields, though getting there requires significant effort. The islands remain remote, wild, and largely unchanged from 1943. Memorials exist, but they are few and far between. A monument on Attu marks the site of the final Banzai charge. A small museum in Dutch Harbor preserves artifacts and memories. But most Americans will never see these places, will never stand where their countrymen fought and died. The Aleut people have worked to preserve their own history of the war years. The trauma of evacuation and imprisonment has been passed down through generations. Efforts to document the experience and seek recognition continue to this day. Let me take you back to where we started. June 1942. Japanese soldiers on American soil. The rising sun flying over Alaska. The unthinkable made real. For 1 year, the United States faced the humiliation of enemy occupation. For 1 year, American soldiers prepared to pay any price to take back what was theirs. On the fog-bound islands of Attu and Kiska, they paid that price. In blood, in suffering, in sacrifice that the nation has largely forgotten. Over 1,500 dead, thousands more wounded or broken, all for islands that most Americans couldn't find on a map. Was it worth it? Strategically, the Aleutians were a sideshow. Japan was never going to conquer Alaska. The resources poured into the campaign might have been used elsewhere. But some things cannot be measured strategically. American territory was occupied. American citizens were captured. The flag was lowered and a foreign banner raised in its place. That could not stand. That would not stand. The men who fought in the Aleutians understood this. They were not fighting for islands. They were fighting for the idea that America would never accept occupation, would never tolerate invasion, would never rest while enemies stood on their soil. They fought in conditions that would break most people. They died in a forgotten corner of a world at war. And they won. Today, Alaska is American. The flags on Attu and Kiska are the stars and stripes. The Japanese occupation is a historical curiosity, a strange footnote that most people have never heard of. But it happened. It mattered. And the men who made it right deserve to be remembered. The next time you look at a map of Alaska, think about the boys who froze in the fog. Think about the Banzai charge at dawn. Think about the ghost ships that evacuated Kiska. Think about the forgotten battle that could have changed everything. And remember, some victories are not celebrated because they happen in places nobody saw. Some heroes are not honored because they fought in wars within the war. Some stories are not told because they don't fit the narratives we prefer. But they are still victories. They are still heroes. And now you know their story. Share it. Remember it. Because if we forget the men of the Aleutians, we forget what it really meant to fight for this country. This was a forgotten battle. The frozen hell. The only ground invasion of American territory in modern history. And now you know the truth. If this story moved you, if you learned something you never knew, hit that subscribe button. We dive deep into the forgotten corners of history, the stories they didn't teach you in school, the truths that deserve to be remembered. Leave a comment telling us about other forgotten battles or hidden histories you want us to explore. Your engagement helps these stories reach more people who deserve to know the truth. And share this video. Share it with anyone who loves history, who cares about remembering sacrifice, who want to understand the real cost of the freedoms we enjoy. The men of Attu and Kiska have been forgotten for 80 years. Let's make sure the next generation remembers them. Until next time, hashtag total voiceover script word count, approximately 5,100 words. Hashtag additional script sections to reach 9,000 plus words. Extended section, the home front and Alaska civilian experience. While soldiers fought and died in the fog of the Aleutians, the rest of Alaska experienced the war in ways that mainland Americans could barely imagine. Before Pearl Harbor, Alaska was a quiet backwater. The total population was barely 75,000 people, scattered across a territory twice the size of Texas. There were almost no roads connecting communities. Travel was by boat or bush plane. Life moved at the pace of the seasons, fishing and hunting and mining in a land that had changed little in decades. The war transformed everything overnight. Suddenly, Alaska was a frontline territory. The military presence exploded from a few hundred soldiers to over 150,000 at the peak. Bases sprouted across the territory. Airfields were carved from wilderness. Roads were pushed through forests and over mountains that had never known pavement. The Alaska Highway was perhaps the most dramatic construction project. Before the war, there was no land route from the continental United States to Alaska. When Japanese forces occupied the Aleutians, military planners realized that sea routes could be cut, leaving Alaska isolated. A road was essential. What followed was one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the war. In just 8 months, from March to November 1942, Army engineers and civilian contractors carved a 1,700-mile road through some of the most challenging terrain in North America. They worked through the brutal winter, through swamps and mountains and permafrost. They battled mosquitoes, so thick that men could barely breathe. They worked around the clock, knowing that every day mattered. The highway was rough and barely usable when it opened, but it existed. Alaska was connected to the rest of America by land for the first time. Supplies and reinforcements could flow north. The threat of isolation was reduced. For Alaska's civilian population, the war brought upheaval and opportunity. Thousands of workers flooded in to support military construction. Towns that had been sleepy fishing villages became boom towns. Money flowed. Prices soared. The traditional way of life was disrupted beyond recognition. Women played crucial roles that history has often overlooked. With so many men in uniform, women took on jobs that had previously been closed to them. They worked in shipyards and factories, in hospitals and offices. They kept communities running while fathers and husbands and sons fought or served. The indigenous peoples of Alaska faced particular challenges. Many young Native men served in the military with distinction. Some became famous scouts and soldiers, using traditional skills to fight in conditions that baffled men from warmer climates. The Alaska Territorial Guard, nicknamed the Eskimo Scouts, patrolled a vast coastline watching for Japanese incursions. But other indigenous communities suffered displacement and discrimination. The evacuation of the Aleuts was a particular tragedy. Even though they were American citizens, even though many of their young men were serving in the military, the entire Aleut population of the Western Islands was forcibly removed from their homes. The official justification was safety. The military claimed it was protecting the Aleuts from Japanese attack. But the reality was more complicated. The camps where the Aleuts were held in southeast Alaska were abandoned canneries and mining camps, lacking adequate food, water, sanitation, or medical care. Disease swept through the confined populations. The death rate was horrific. Meanwhile, back in the Aleutians, the abandoned Aleut villages were looted. Soldiers and workers took religious artifacts, personal belongings, anything of value. Churches were ransacked. Homes were destroyed. When the Aleuts were finally allowed to return after the war, They found their communities in ruins. It took decades for any acknowledgement of this wrong. Not until 1988 did the federal government formally apologize and provide compensation to surviving Aleuts and their descendants. By then, many of the victims were long dead, and the traditional way of life had been lost forever. This, too, is part of the Aleutian Campaign. This, too, deserves to be remembered. We have told this story primarily from the American side. But what about the Japanese? Who were the men who invaded American soil, and what motivated them? The Japanese soldiers who occupied Attu and Kiska were not the fanatical stereotypes of wartime propaganda. They were human beings with families and fears and hopes, caught up in a war they did not choose. Many of them came from the Japanese Army's northern district, units that had trained in the frozen wastes of Manchuria and were considered better prepared for Arctic conditions than regular Japanese forces. They were tough, disciplined soldiers who had already experienced brutal cold and harsh terrain. But nothing had prepared them for the Aleutians. The isolation was crushing, unlike soldiers fighting in the South Pacific, who could at least see palm trees and blue water. The men on Attu and Kiska saw only fog and volcanic rock and endless gray sky. Mail from home was sporadic at best. News from the wider war was censored and unreliable. They knew only that they were at the edge of the world, forgotten by everyone. As 1942 turned to 1943, supplies became increasingly scarce. The Japanese Navy, reeling from defeats at Midway and Guadalcanal, could no longer spare ships to resupply distant outposts. The men on the islands went hungry. They ran low on ammunition. Medical supplies dwindled. Winter clothing wore out and could not be replaced. Disease became as dangerous as any enemy. Beriberi, caused by vitamin deficiency, weakened men who were already starving. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Psychological problems multiplied as the endless fog and isolation took their toll. And still they fortified. Still they prepared. They knew the Americans would come eventually. They dug trenches and bunkers. They positioned artillery and machine guns. They made the best of an impossible situation. When the American invasion finally came to Attu in May 1943, Colonel Yamasaki's men fought with ferocity born of desperation. They had nowhere to retreat. They expected no rescue. Their only choices were victory, death, or the unthinkable shame of surrender. The Banzai charge was not irrational from their perspective. It was a final assertion of warrior honor in a situation that offered no hope. By attacking, by taking as many enemies as possible with them, they could die as soldiers rather than starve as prisoners. Modern readers may find it difficult to understand this mentality, but we must remember the context. These men had been taught from childhood that surrender was worse than death, that dying for the emperor was the highest honor, that their spirits would be enshrined as gods if they fell in battle. Whether this belief system was wise or foolish, noble or tragic, it was sincere. The men who charged into American machine gun fire on that foggy morning believed they were doing the right thing. They were products of their culture and their time, just as American soldiers were products of theirs. The 29 Japanese soldiers who survived to become prisoners were unusual. Most of them were wounded so badly they could not participate in the final attack. Some were unconscious when they were captured. A few made the agonizing choice to live, defying everything they had been taught, perhaps hoping to see their families again. What became of these survivors is largely unknown. The Japanese military did not celebrate captured soldiers. Their families often faced shame and ostracism. After the war, many former POWs chose to disappear into anonymity rather than face judgment. The dead received more honor. The final defenders of Attu are commemorated at Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, alongside millions of other Japanese war dead. Whether this constitutes appropriate remembrance or controversial glorification depends on one's perspective. What is certain is that they too deserve to be understood, if not celebrated. They were enemies, but they were also human beings facing impossible circumstances. Their story is part of the Aleutian Campaign, too. To fully understand the significance of the Aleutian Campaign, we must place it in the broader context of World War II strategy. By June 1942, when the Japanese invaded Attu and Kiska, the war was at a critical inflection point. The initial Japanese offensive was running out of steam. They had achieved spectacular conquests, but they lacked the resources to defend everything they had taken. American industrial power was ramping up. The question was whether Japan could consolidate their gains before America became too strong. Admiral Yamamoto's Midway operation was intended to answer this question decisively. By destroying the American carrier fleet and capturing Midway, Japan would push the defensive perimeter far enough east that America would have to negotiate. The Aleutian diversion was meant to draw American attention north, away from the Central Pacific. It didn't work. American codebreakers had cracked Japanese naval communications. Admiral Chester Nimitz knew the Midway attack was coming and prepared an ambush. The Battle of Midway, fought June 4 to 7, 1942, destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft and pilots. It was a turning point of the Pacific War. The Aleutian operation succeeded tactically, but became strategically irrelevant. The islands were captured, but they no longer served any purpose. They could not support a further advance. They could not threaten the American mainland. They were simply distant outposts that required supply and defense. For the next year, both sides poured resources into the Aleutians that might have been better used elsewhere. Japan sent men and ships to hold islands of dubious value. America launched bombing raids and naval patrols against positions that posed no real threat. The campaign became a sideshow that neither side could abandon. The strategic lesson is that territory alone does not win wars. Attu and Kiska look impressive on a map, but they contributed nothing to Japan's war effort, holding them tied down resources desperately needed elsewhere. The decision to retreat from Kiska, though embarrassing, was strategically sound. For America, the campaign demonstrated both the strengths and weaknesses of a democracy at war. The public demanded action against the occupation of American soil, regardless of strategic logic. Political pressure forced military commitments that might not have been made on purely military grounds. But the campaign also showed American adaptability. The military learned from the disasters of Attu. Cold weather equipment was improved. Training was enhanced. Tactics were refined. When later operations required Arctic or near-Arctic combat, from Korea to potential Cold War scenarios, the lessons of the Aleutians proved valuable. Speak like a 75-year-old American World War II combat veteran who was actually in the Aleutians. Voices deep, gravelly, slightly hoarse from decades of cigarettes and cold. You have seen things no one should see, and you are finally telling the story no one wanted to hear. Every sentence carries weight. Occasional quiet pauses as memories hit hard. No excitement. No hype. Just raw truth told by a man who still wakes up from nightmares in fog. Tone is somber, haunted, and quietly angry that this battle was forgotten. This is the last time you will ever tell it.